Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here to listen to this story. If you're listening on YouTube, this is the only time I'm going to ask that you do drop a subscription. And be sure to like the video. Make sure that you come back if you do enjoy this and want to listen to more story times with Duck. Today we have a fun story. Today's theme is fantasy, and I think the next week of videos, if not more, are going to be of the same theme. I really like the idea of fantasy and otherworldly stuff. So without further ado, this is The Wraith. I found this story on Azrian Portal. It does not have an author's name. How does it look? Carefully, I gripped my companion by the shoulder and pulled him away from the slippery stone wall. He left behind stains of blood on the cobalt rocks, strands thick and black sticking to where he once rested. In the flickering firelight, what little I could see was pure horror. 3 deep gashes, each about 3 inches apart, were scored across his back from left waist to right shoulder. A mess of torn flesh, muscle, and tendons. He had been ripped to the bone, right through his thick furs and leathers. In the freezing temperatures, the blood seemed to flow less willingly, but this made the injury no less grim. Slowly, I let him roll back to his resting place against the wall of the cave. The heat from the fire warmed the rocks that encased us, forming droplets of water that either dripped from the jagged ceiling or slid their way down the curved wall. I wiped my hands on the moisture, trying to remove some of the blood that coated them. I've seen worse. On a gutted pig, he chuckled, breathlessly, his voice rattling. You need to rest. The wound will heal enough by morning. He gave another hollow laugh and smiled, a crooked, disbelieving smile. You make it pay, won't you? We will, I insisted, putting my hands on his shoulder. I looked the dying man in the eye, hoping that some of my confidence would inspire him to keep fighting. He just gazed back, his eyelids drooping. I could tell he was tired. So very, very tired. He didn't seem to have the energy to fight or to even care about that he was facing his last moments. Harsh winds wailed past the entrance to the cave. A blizzard was tearing through the night beyond our little shelter. I could feel the bitterness of the frozen world outside, the dwindling fire a meager offering compared to the unrelenting nightmare of snow. Little protection against the sharp, icy winds that crept their way into our abode. By the time dawn broke, I was huddled in the deepest corner of the cave, wrapped tightly in the fur cloak I had thought would keep me warm in these unforgiving mountains. My companion lay dead, taken either by his wounds or the ice that encrusted his lips and eyelashes. The fire had died about the same time he did. So long ago that it was no longer even smoldering. The blizzard had cleared, but the snow still fell. It almost never stopped falling on the mountains. In a stupor of hunger and sleep deprivation, I emerged from the cave. The sun had only just risen above the towering mountain peaks, but shone so brightly between the gaps of gray cloud that swarmed overhead, I was nearly blinded. Its rays streamed off every flake of glossy white snow that coated everything in sight. From giant boulders jutting from the canyon walls to the trees that lined the deep valley sprawling away over both of my shoulders. We'd found our hideaway halfway up the side of the valley the night before. As night fell, a lucky break in the barrage of snow meant that the dark, rocky archway caught my eye, a striking contrast against the white world that surrounded it. In a rush of cries and blood and panic, we'd scrambled inside. There was no sign of that now. No sign of the frantic night before. The snow made everything so elegant, so calm, so clean. I had no idea where I was going now. I had no idea what I was going to do. The man that lay dead inside the cave was the smart one, my problem solver. The man that lay dead somewhere in the snow before me was my navigator, the one who could tell me where to go. I was just the muscle, the farmhand with a large sword and the will to swing it. I was alone. My father had always warned me about coming into the mountains. There were two truths in life, he used to say: that the mountains were no place for farm folk, and that Uncle Ryle was a no-good swindler. I learned as a boy that my uncle was not a swindler, he was just better at business. I learned as a boy that my uncle was not a swindler, he was just good at business, but many years later I was finally learning my father wasn't wrong about everything. But I had a purpose for being here. We all had a purpose. We knew there were risks. There is nothing left for me now. Nothing left but to finish what we started. I dug my boots into the snow beneath and trudged on. Where I was traveling east, north, west, I had no idea. But I knew what I was looking for. I knew that I was hunting. Wraiths left behind a sort of luminous mist wherever they moved, like the shimmering trail of a slug. This was how we knew what had slaughtered the people of the village. This is how I knew who had killed, or I should say what had killed my father. Often the trails meant it was easy to avoid the race, but I wasn't looking to avoid this one. We found it already, or should I say, it found us. Its bright, frosty blue eyes had emerged from in the encircling blizzard last night, appearing as if from nowhere out of the gloom. I immediately took a swing, and I missed, but it didn't. It took out my navigator with a slash off of its left claws, falling away into the blizzard, lost in the night forever. In the same moment, the beast carved up my companion with the right claw. There was no chance to defend ourselves. No chance to fight after that. We just had to run. It had now taken everything from me. The last survivor. My family, my home. I couldn't even go back to the farm, not really. Growing food on the frozen plains that lay in the shadow of these hellish mountains was damn near impossible. Getting the conditions right in the frigid temperatures where ice never left the ground took a lifetime of experience, and my father had not yet managed to teach me all that I needed to know. 22 years apparently was still not enough to be a farmer in a world ruled by frost. All I know was my goal. Our goal. To kill the beast that stole my future. We weren't even sure why I was in the village. Not in my lifetime. Not my father's, nor his father's before him, had a Wraith left the mountains. He used to tell me all about them as the hearth crackled away. The stories had grown even longer of late. With the new mining going on in the mountains, they brought to the village some new stone fuel. And with that, the fire burned longer than ever. Stories of monstrous creatures in the mountains, blood-thirsty demons of an old world. My father would regale me with the tales of wraiths cutting down weary travelers and season nights alone. He himself had never seen one, nor had anyone else that I knew, but we all knew what they were. The stories were as old as time. The miner's work got me asking even more questions about my father's rules, though. Why were they allowed into the mountains if they were so dangerous? Apparently, a combination of military convoys and fire-wielding sorceresses kept them safe from both the elements and the wraiths. I was a bit disgruntled with the notion that I was so incapable when they were not. Those feelings had long passed. I wandered through the frost-touched valley for what seemed like an eternity. The land was beautiful but barren. There was no food, no warmth, and no life, save the snow-laden pine trees that reached out for miles. I was feeling weaker and weaker and weaker by the minute. I had lost our supplies in the rush the previous night. The pack of food was now buried under inches of snow. I knew I'd never find it. I didn't bother to search. Between dazzling brightness and dreary gloom, depending on how covered by clouds the sun was, I started to feel my resolve wane. I wanted to quit, to give up and leave this glorious, deadly place behind. But I couldn't. I thought of the mangled bodies of my family. The guilt was overwhelming. Had I been there, not in the city chasing women, I might have been able to fend off the beast. My village wasn't home to many able young men, only 3, and none had been around when it came. Then I thought of my companion in the cave, the frost surely still biting as he quickly froze to death. The guilt was worse still. As they wept over their families, my heart filled with rage. I felt the anger wash over me, masking the pain. I knew that now, as the cold bit at my own heart and began to thaw the fiery anger that burned inside, I had to almost drag our navigator into the mountains, and now he lay dead within them. My companion was only slightly more willing. The Wraith took both his wife and daughter, but even he wouldn't have set foot in these treacherous slopes if I hadn't driven him to it. I goaded him, playing off his torment. I had to kill the beast. It was the only way to unburden my guilty conscience. Was the wraith that attacked us last night the same that cut down the villagers? It was impossible to say. They all look identical, apparently. We didn't know exactly how many were living in these mountains, but we did know that they were mindless killers. That even if I slew the wrong one, I'd redeem myself by calling a true vision of evil. Wraiths were ancient creatures powered only by the lust of death. I was always told that they didn't consume the flesh of their prey. They took the very life from them and fed off that instead. I didn't believe it, and I was still not sure, except for one of the massive slashes across his torso where the wraith had cleaved him as he was working the fields. My father looked as if he ever did when I found him. I expected the draining of life to look more dramatic. But maybe it wasn't something you could see. I continued to struggle on through the wilderness, my feet sliding into inches of fresh snow with every step. My pace was slow and staggering. I had no direction in my mind, just eyes peeled for the sight of that luminous, foggy trail. Bitter breezes sailed through the trees constantly, biting me from all angles. Beneath my thick furs, I was covered in leather padding wrapped in yet more furs. Beneath that were light, tight linens tucked into my boots and gloves. I was used to the freezing temperatures, and I knew how to keep them out, but the mountains, these winds gathered speed as they whipped through the deep valleys. Even I was succumbing to the pain of the cold. The steel greatsword heavy on my back was not helping. Nothing changed all day, other than I progressively shrank into myself, residing to the fact that I would simply wander these frozen wastes until I collapsed and died, dead wraith or not. I wasn't even sure I'd be able to fight the monster alone when I was fit and healthy. Not least now when I was ragged and tired, cold, weak, hungry. But what else could I do? I didn't know my way out of the mountains, even if I was coward enough to run. And yes, I thought about it. But when things changed, it began with a bang. A horrible, low rumble that emanated from far away in the mountains, shaking the very ground around me and knocking snow from the branches overhead. It lasted only a second. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Then, on the far side of the ravine, through the weary trees, I saw cracks emerge in the snow like splits in an ice-bound lake stuck with pickaxe. With a groan, the snow started to slide, slowly at first, but quickly picking up pace. It was crashing towards the deepest part of the valley, exactly where I stood. Heaving my stiff legs through the dense snow, I ambled frantically towards the other side of the valley, fear driving my frozen body to move faster than it should. I went up higher and higher until I could no further, blocked by the steep rock walls. Looking back, I saw snow swarm where I once stood, burying the land deep enough to cover me several times over. The force of the drift had brought down trees and uncovered a great expanse of bare rock on the cliff of the valley's side. Whatever had just happened transformed the landscape. It was as if I was standing in a totally different space, But that was not what interested me the most. Down in the pit of the valley where the fresh moved snow now lay, I could see something moving. Ducking behind a tree, I peered around to watch. A lone wraith was moving around frantically in the canyon below, similar to a fly trapped in a jar. It was slashing wildly, dashing from tree to tree, cutting them with ease. It was hard to make out some of its features so far away, but it was definitely a wraith. About the size of a man, floating a foot or so above the ground. It left glowing trails of frosty blue dust in its wake. After a moment of what seemed like sheer panic, it let out a shriek, a piercing, almost metallic noise before darting away, dragging its low-slung claws through the dusty, unsettled snow. With haste, I followed just fast enough to outrun the dispersal of its trail. Walking through the mist was like walking through the heat, the heart of winter itself. The air was so cold. It dragged deep into my lungs and felt like every breath was scarring them. I could feel ice forming on the hairs above my lip. I looked to a path beside the wraith's trail. I wouldn't last long within it, and I was already on my last legs as it was. Pushing forward took every scrap of energy I had, but I knew this would be my only chance. The wraith had moved far, its path leading me out of the sprawling valley into the shores of a great frozen lake that stood between three looming mountain peaks. The frantic trail had slowly become calmer. The darting from side to side had stopped, as the beast's focus seemed to have narrowed. The trails were also thicker and more densely packed, spun with more and more floating specks of shimmering blue dust. I think it had slowed down. I found it, seemingly rummaging through a bush of succulent red berries on the edge of an expansive lake. If I was to fight it, I was to fight it now, before I lost a single ounce more of my strength. The fires of revenge lit my heart again at the sight of the wraith. They would keep me moving. Even if I was cold, and the cold was trying to turn my bones to ice, my desire to slay the beast was all my mind's eye was fixed on. That, getting to those juicy berries on the bush behind it. We farmed those berries all the time. They grew on the slopes of the mountains just outside the village in abundance. All of us were unreachable up the side of the great snow-covered clefts. They were delicious and hearty. It would keep me going a little while longer, with my heart pounding and my palms sweaty despite the bitter, bitter cold. I drew my sword with a clatter of steel. The wraith spun around. In a smooth, gliding motion, its glowing blue eyes immediately found me. They were empty, soulless, without any humanity or emotion. They just glowed, a hollow glow. Its eyes were set inside a narrow, elongated, and pointed skull, gray and bare, a skull more like an ox's than a man's. From the skull grew a spine of large bones, as big as a fist, that slowly trailed off into smaller pieces until one pointed bone hung about a foot from the ground. Just below its head, two arms sprang, seemingly from nowhere, attached not to the shoulder blades nor spine. To the arms were fixed giant claws, each longer than my forearms, thin, curved, and sharp. There was no muscle, no flesh or skin on the wraith, nothing holding its bones together but a thick fog of glowing blue dust that clung to its form. Legend has it that a stroke of a sword through the spine would sever the magic that bound this ancient monster together, and that the wraith would simply crumble. As I was about to find out if that were true. As I approached, the beast's gaze bore into me. It moved slowly, seemingly cautious, stopping and starting. Edging closer, I gripped my sword with both hands, raised it as steady as I could, and prepared to swing. But then about 10 feet away, the wraith stopped. It let out a hollow snort. Again, the noise was metallic, an unusual sound for a living creature to make. To my surprise, it didn't charge, leap, or race towards me, slashing its talons. The wraith simply turned and started to glide away, ignoring my presence. But by disbelief, where was it going? Why was it trying to tear me apart? My confusion turned to anger. Did it think that it could just kill my father and get away with it? Did it think that I would just let it float away? No! I screamed, my voice echoing across the expanse before me. It didn't even turn around. Just kept moving towards another patch of berries nearby. I'd had enough. I started to run, the snow thinned by the lake's edge, allowing swifter movement. I held my sword high. I was going to kill it. I was going to take my revenge. One slice across its back. It was too easy. But I was going to do it. For my father. For my companions. For the... My foot caught the lip of concealed rock beneath the snow, and I tumbled forward. Sword flung from my hand. I landed face down in the snow. My strength evaporated in that moment. My body was so battered, so achy, so cold, that it hurt. I couldn't bring myself to rise. I could just lay here and die. I steeled what little resolve I had and rolled over to face the sky. Above me, I saw the sky. I saw blue. But it wasn't the soft blue of the clear sky. It was darker and shimmered in the sunlight. The wraith was above me. Its long, gangly, claw-ridden arms either side of my head. It gazed down, arching its spine, peering at me. I prepared myself for the end. Yet again, the wraith shocked me. After a moment of curiosity, it moved on, far more interested in the berries than me. Hauling myself to the feet, I grasped my sword on the ground beside me. I dug it into the ice and used it to prop myself up as I stood, panting, watching the ancient being. I didn't understand. The wraith leaned over the bush, using its claws to cut away thicker branches and dead foliage. Taking a long, jagged breath, it made a sound like hollowing wind blasting through a cave. How it breathed without lungs, I'll never know, but it did seem to do all the same. The bush rustled and the wraith inhaled, began to wither, the berries turning from a cherry red to a moldy black, their plump and juicy shape sagging and oozing. The wraith moved on to yet another bush. There were plenty in this exposed part of the mountains. The scene unfolding before me was nothing like I had expected a wraith encounter to be like. It was peaceful. The fires of my rage, my desire for revenge, were all but extinguished. Instead, I felt the cold creeping up inside my body, taking every inch from me. My breath was slow and shallow, and I could no longer feel my heart beating in my neck. I wonder if it was beating at all. What drove me no longer did, but now I had no reason to go on. I could no longer feel my legs, my hands gripping my sword, or anything else for that matter. I just felt the ice in my veins, ice in my heart. I caught one final glimpse of the wraith, draining the life from another patch of berries, before my hand slipped from the hilt and I felt the snow envelop me. What followed was a haze. I could feel myself moving, snow rushing over my shoulders, down my back, and into the crevices of my boots. I was being dragged. My eyelids were heavy and frozen shut, but I could see light flickering beyond them. Then I saw darkness. I was no longer being dragged through the snow. I was on a much rougher surface. I tore my eyes open and cast a look around. I found myself in yet another cave, now propped up against the wall just as my companion had been. The navigator crouched over me, grinning. He reached behind and beneath his shredded fur coat. It was slung over his shoulders haphazardly, his proper form destroyed by large gashes all across it. He pulled out a handful of berries. He pushed them towards me. I took them without a thought, without even a thank you. I thought you were dead, I croaked, after scoffing down the sweet berries. I thought you were dead, the navigator replied, nodding to the tracks that lay outside the cave, the marks on my body that he'd been dragging through the glistening snow. I slew the monster. What? The beast was just there, looking at a bush. It didn't even notice me sneak up. I took your sword and cut it in half. The stories are true, you know. One swing is all it took. When would I stop feeling it? This all-consuming guilt, sadness overcame me. The morning feelings I should have had for my father, instead I had unbridled anger. The anger that had cost too many too much. The navigator could see the look on my face, the look of regret, sorrow, and devastation, not the joy and retribution he'd been seeking. I didn't feel anything I thought I'd feel, just felt more pain. Pain for another life lost for no reason.